Hey y'all, today we're going to talk more about trigonometry, and I just want to remind you of our three trig ratios that we also call trig functions. Remember, we had the sine of an angle, and that was equal to the opposite side over the hypotenuse. Cosine of an angle, that was equal to the adjacent side over the hypotenuse. And tangent of an angle, that was equal to the opposite side over the adjacent. And so we use those last lesson to write fractions, and then we also use them to figure out how long a missing side was. But sometimes what we want to use them for is to figure out how big an angle is. And so we can introduce these inverse functions, and inverse functions are like opposite functions. So like addition and subtraction are inverse, multiplication and division, a square root and a squared. These are things that cancel each other out. And so we have these inverse functions, and we write them like this with like a -1. It looks like an exponent, but it means inverse. Sine inverse, cosine inverse, tangent inverse. And what those functions will do will cancel out the regular sine, cosine, and tangent, the one they correspond to. And we can use that to find the measure of angles. So we are going to set up our problems similar to what we did last time. So I have this angle I'm looking for. And so I'm going to label it OA and H, opposite, adjacent, and hypotenuse. There's my hypotenuse. I like to find that one first, across from the 90. My adjacent side is the one that's next to the angle. So there's my A, and then this side is O. And so last time we looked at what we knew, and we tried to pick the appropriate function. So right now I have labeled the adjacent and the hypotenuse. That tells me I'm using cosine. So I'm going to set up a cosine problem. We always put the angle next to the function. In this case, my angle is question mark. I'll put that in parentheses. And that's equal to my adjacent side, 35, over my hypotenuse, 55. And so I can't put cosine of question mark into the calculator, but I can use my new inverse functions to solve for question mark. So I want to cancel out cosine. Much like if we had a scenario like this, if we wanted to solve for x, we would do the opposite of multiplying by 2, and we would divide by 2 on both sides, and we would do it to both sides. So if I want to cancel out cosine, I'm going to do the cosine inverse of both sides of my function. And this might look a little sloppy. You could write it as a next line if you want to. And so cosine inverse and cosine are going to cancel each other out, and I'm going to be left with just my question mark, that angle I'm looking for. And then I'm going to be taking the cosine inverse of 35 over 55. And this is something now that we can put into our calculator. So if you go to Desmos, first thing you're going to want to do is click that wrench and make sure that the word degrees is highlighted. There are two ways to measure an angle. We're dealing with degrees. If you're not in the correct mode, then you'll get a wrong answer. So I'm going to go to my functions, and you can see there are my inverse functions. So I'm going to do the cosine of 35 divided by 55, and I get this answer. So we are close to, we'll call it 50.5. Our angle is close to 50.5 degrees. And so we found this angle in the triangle. And of course, we know this angle is 90, and if we really wanted to, we could use our knowledge of angles adding to 180 to find the other angle. We don't need to do that now, but we could if we wanted to. And so just using this technique to find one missing piece could lead you to other missing pieces. So if I look at this triangle, if I want to find this angle, I want to label my sides. There's my hypotenuse, there's my adjacent side, and there's my opposite. And so again, I have a cosine. I know the adjacent and the hypotenuse, so I'm going to set this up as cosine of my angle equals my adjacent over my hypotenuse. And then in order to cancel out that cosine, I'm going to do the cosine inverse of both sides. And those will cancel. So again, I can go into my calculator and I could find that function cosine inverse 55 divided by 58, and I get, we'll say 18.5. So that angle is approximately 18.5 degrees. So let me show one more. And we're always going to start these trig problems the same way. We're always going to identify the angle of interest and label the sides. There's H, there's A, it's the side next to my angle, and this one is O. So O and H indicate that we need to be using sine, opposite and hypotenuse. So sine of my angle is equal to the opposite side divided by the hypotenuse. And again, anytime that we are trying to find an angle, we need to use this inverse function. Regular sine, cosine, and tangent will help us find a missing side. Inverse sine, cosine, and tangent will help us find a missing angle. So we need to cancel out sine by doing sine inverse. And so whatever we do to one side of an equation, we do to the other side. That hasn't changed from algebra. Those will cancel each other. And now we have something that we can put into our calculator to get an angle measure. So again, functions, sine inverse, 33 divided by 35, and we'll get, I'll say 70.5 degrees. So again, we start these things the same way. We label our sides O, A, and H based on the angle of interest. Last time it was an angle measure we knew and we used to find a missing side. This time it's an angle measure we want to know. We want to know how big this angle is based on the side lengths. And just a really important reminder that before you try to use sine, cosine, tangent, sine inverse, cosine inverse, tangent inverse, you always want to check that wrench. Make sure you're in degrees because there's a big potential for getting wrong answers even if you're doing correct math. So this is a place where I want you to pause. I want you to try this number 4. Label your sides, pick the correct function, and then see if you can solve it. Use Desmos to help you with the inverse functions. So pause and then press play for your answer. So hopefully you chose tangent. Hopefully you set up your O, A, and H correctly. If not, make sure that you get some help on that. And hopefully, at the very least, you set up this, what I have in blue. Your tangent function is the opposite side over the adjacent side. And then use that inverse function to end up solving for your missing angle. Make sure you use Desmos. It's a really helpful tool. Make sure you're in degree mode. And if you did have any questions about this lesson, write them down. If I happen to not be in class, it's a good idea to write them down so that you can ask me the next time you see me, or you can ask the teacher in the classroom if they're good with math. There are some questions here at the end that I want you to try and answer on Edpuzzle, so make sure that you watch all the way to the end of the video and ask the questions related to these 4 triangles. As always, the best way to get better at this is to ask for help when you need it and to do some practice. So there are some suggested practice, lots of practice problems on Canvas. Again, ask for help if you need it, do some practice, and good luck.